In the previous video, we set up our project, created our domain entities, and implement an audit in our domain entities. Now we will create our API to create and get invoices. We will follow the command query responsibility segregation in building our API, and we will use MediatR to help us manage our requests, and FluentValidation for validating our data. So let's start. We will use MediatR and FluentValidation in our project, so we need to install them in our application layer. After installing the packages, we can now start our development. So here in our application layer, create a new folder called Invoices. Following the CQRS approach, we will separate our command to our queries. So let's create a folder for our command. Then we will create our first command. We will call it create invoice command. Our create invoice command will have the properties that we need to create an invoice. So we can just copy the properties in our invoice. We can remove the ID. We don't need this one. It is not a good practice to expose your domain entities in the API. So instead of using the invoice item, I will create a view model. So here in invoices, let's create a folder, view model, and then let's create our invoice item view model. Let's copy the properties of our invoice item. We don't need the invoice and invoice ID. Then here, instead of invoice item, it should be invoice item VM. As you can see, our create invoice command looks like just a simple class which contain properties. The only difference is it inherits the I request of MediatR. And then inside this two arrowhead, we will put the expected output of this command. When we create the invoice, I expect it to return the ID, so it will be int. Let's add another property in our invoice item VM. Let's add amount. This is one of the advantage of using view model. You can add properties, or you can just lessen the properties that you want to use. So now back to our command. When we create a request for our create invoice command, we need something to handle the command. And to do that, we need the handlers. So let's do the handler for our create invoice command. Inside the invoices folder, create a folder called handlers. And then add a new class called create invoice command handler. This will inherit the I request handler from MediatR. Then this expects two parameter. One is the type of the request, the command, and then the output. Our request is the create invoice command, and then the output will be the int. So let's implement this interface. This is create invoice command. So what we need to do here is to save the invoice to the database. So we need the application DB context. So let's inject it here in our constructor. Then here in the handle method, we will create a new instance of invoice, and then we will map the properties of our create invoice command to our invoice. Then we will save it to the database and return the ID of the new invoice. We need to make this one an async, and then let's return the ID of the new invoice. Now that we have our command and a handler, when we use this in MediatR, we can save our data in the database, but the problem is we need the validation here. We need the from to be not empty, also the to, also amount paid, and also the invoice item list should not be a null or empty list. So to do that, we will make use of mediator pipeline behavior. The mediator pipeline behavior is like the event on how the mediator handled the request. So there will be a time before the request was handled, and then when it was handled, and after handling the request. So using that pipeline behavior, we can add some logging in our requests. But in this project, we will not do the logging. What we're going to do is we will add the validation before the mediator handle our create invoice command. For our validation behavior, I will not going to write a code for it. There's a lot of sample in the internet. So instead of creating my own, I will just get the validation behavior which other developers are using. I will get this one from GitHub. This is the class that we need the validation behavior. But let's also have a look in the Stack Overflow. As you can see, this is just similar class. So a lot of developers are using this class. So instead of creating my own, I will just copy them. So it is a validation behavior. Create a folder here in common folder. Let's call the folder behaviors. Okay, now that we have our validation behavior, let's create our validator for create invoice command. In the invoices folder, create a new folder called validators. Then create a new class called create invoice command validator. This class will inherit the abstract validator from FluentValidation. And then it expects you to give the class that you need to validate. In this case, it is the create invoice command. Then here in the constructor, we will set our validation rule. So what we want is the amount paid should not be null, same as the date. Then the property of from and to should not be an empty and have a minimum length of 3 characters. Then the invoice items should not be an empty list. So let's add our validation rule. Here in the invoice items, we need to create a custom property validator. So to do that, let's add a new class. Let's call it must have invoice item property validator. Then this class will implement the property validator of FluentValidation. Let's add the constructor. So here in the constructor, we can pass the error message in the base. So let's add our base. Then here, what we need is to check that the list is not null and also it is not an empty list. Now let's use our property validator in our create invoice command. Now we need to register our mediator and FluentValidation in the services. So here in the application layer, let's create a class called dependency injection. And let's add this into our startup file. Now that we have our command and handler, it's now time to use it in our API. Let's create a controller. First, I want to create a base controller for my API. I will just call it API controller. Let's declare here our mediator. So every controller that will inherit our API controller will have the property mediator on it. Now let's create our invoices controller. Since we have the audit in invoice entity, we need to restrict this invoices controller that only a login user or registered user are able to create an invoice. So to do that, let's add the attribute authorize. Then let's create our action to create an invoice. Now let's check if our controller is working. I will be using the postman to test the endpoint, but since the controller need a login user, I will just copy the token here and then put it in my postman. This one should fail because I don't have the from. So this one should throw an error when I send this request. Yeah, as you can see, my validation failed. It said the from must not be empty and the length of from must be at least 3 characters. So my validation is working. Let's try if this is a valid company. ABC company. Now it returns the status of 200 and then return the ID of the invoice. So our endpoint for create invoice command is working. Now it's time to create the query request. For the query, it will output the properties of the invoice, but I don't want to expose my invoice domain entity. So what will I do is I will add another view model, the invoice view model, which have the properties of the invoice. Then let's copy the properties from invoice. And then this one, instead of invoice item, it should be invoice item VM. Let's add the date when it was created. Now let's create our query request to get the invoices of the current login user. So to do that, in our invoices folder, let's add a new folder called queries. Then let's create a class. Let's call it get user invoices query. This will inherit the I request, and then we'll have the output of list of invoice VM. Then the only property that we need here is the user ID of the current user. Now that we have our query, it's time to create our handler that will handle our requests. Then we also need the application DB context here to query the data. So let's inject it here in the constructor. Now let's do the query here in our handle method. Let's make this one an async. Now that we have our query handler, let's go back to our controller and use it. For the user, we already created our service earlier for the current user service. Let's inject it in the Invoices controller. Okay, let's try our API if it is working. I will use the same token as the one I use in the post request. Oh, why this? Oh, okay. We have forgot to add the action here. This is HTTP post. This one is HTTP get. Okay, let's test it again. Let's send our request once again. And now we are able to get our invoice. So our query request is working. As you can see, after the setup that we did in earlier videos, creating the query or getting the data, creating our commands and query become easier, and also our controller becomes cleaner, though there's still some things that we can improve in our code. If you have a look in our handler, here we manually map the property from one class to another. In this case, it is create invoice command to invoice, same as this one. We can shorten and we can make it cleaner with the help of a library called AutoMapper. In the next video, I will show you how to use AutoMapper to map the properties of one class to another.